The wind moved through the cottonwoods with a restless whisper, rattling the frost-stiff leaves that clung stubbornly to the branches. Daniel Carter paused with his hands braced on the worn haft of the shovel, breath misting in the lantern glow. The barn was quiet save for the shuffling of a mare in her stall and the faint hiss of grain sliding into the trough. Somewhere beyond the weathered planks, in the small house crouched against the wind, a cough broke the night. Harsh, wet, and too familiar. He straightened slowly, muscles aching under the weight of 12 hard years. The sound came again, thin and sharp, like a saw biting into greenwood. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the barn seemed to tilt beneath him. Not now, he told himself. Not yet. The lantern flame fluttered as he set the shovel aside. Beyond the barn door, the yard was silvered in moonlight, the grass brittle under a crust of ice. His boots left sharp prints as he crossed the porch. Inside, the fire still burned in the stone hearth, painting the walls with restless shadows. Anna sat near it, her skirts bunched under her knees, reading by the light, lips moving with silent words. She glanced up, smiled faintly, then bent back to her page. Samuel was already asleep on the couch, one arm draped over his face, the other hanging limp toward the floor. Ben sat cross-legged by the fire, a little carved horse, trotting circles in the dirt at his feet. The boy looked up, grinning when he saw his father. "Ma says a man ought to be in bed this time of night," Ben said. Daniel crouched beside him, ruffling his hair. "You must said a lot of things," he murmured. The words caught in his throat before he could push them further. Anna set her book aside. "Pa, you should—" "I'll get there," he said, lifting his hat from the peg and hanging it on the wall. His voice was soft, but it carried the finality of a man used to giving orders. By dawn, the world was pale and brittle under a sky the color of gunmetal. Daniel was already at the stove, the smell of frying bacon drifting through the small cabin. Samuel emerged first, rubbing sleep from his eyes, followed by Anna, hair half loosened from its braid. Ben came last, tugging at his shirt buttons, yawning so wide he nearly stumbled over the threshold to the kitchen. They ate quickly. No one lingered over meals in winter. There was stock to see to, wood to cut, traps to check before the sun dropped behind the hills. Samuel shoveled the last of his eggs into his mouth and reached for his coat. "I'll ride out to the north pasture today," he said. "You'll help your sister with the storeroom first." Daniel replied without looking up from his plate. "Then we'll see." The boy's jaw tightened a little, but he nodded. Samuel had his mother's stubbornness. Daniel saw it every time the boy's gaze met his, level and unblinking. Outside, the day sharpened. Frost snapped underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from the neighboring homesteads. As they worked, the sound of wagon wheels on hard ground carried across the valley. Daniel looked up to see a two-horse rig pulling into town from the west, the driver wrapped in a dark coat. Behind him sat a tall man with a narrow face and eyes that seemed to measure the distance between every building. By the time the wagon stopped near the general store, Daniel recognized the driver, old Hank Moore, who ferried goods from Deadwood once a month. But it was the other man who held his gaze. Neat, precise movements. A leather case strapped beside him. Daniel's mouth tightened. The traveling doctor had come again. Anna noticed too. "Pa, you could ask him about your cough. It's fine." "It's not," she said, quietly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Daniel didn't answer. He turned back to stacking sacks of grain, the weight solid and grounding in his hands. When he finally looked up again, the doctor was standing just inside the store, talking with the shopkeeper. For a moment their eyes met. Something flickered in the man's gaze, a quick narrowing, as though recognition tugged at the edges of his mind. He didn't linger. Soon enough the wagon rolled on, heading toward the edge of town where a widow kept rooms for travelers. But the weight in Daniel's chest didn't ease. That night, as the fire burned low, his mind slipped backward. 12 years to a night thick with smoke and rain. He was younger then, quicker on his feet, the weight of the badge heavy on his chest. The cabin had gone up fast, flames tearing through dry timber, heat biting the skin from his hands as he fought his way inside. The baby had been crying, his wife coughing so hard she nearly collapsed in his arms as he carried her out. Behind him, voices shouted through the downpour. One cut sharper than the rest. "You'll regret this, Carter." In the chaos, he dropped to his knees in the corner of the cabin, tearing up the plank beneath the stove. His fingers closed around the small, iron box hidden there. Heat scorched his knuckles as he shoved it into his coat. Inside that box was the reason they'd come for him, the reason the sheriff had turned his back, the reason a man's life could never again be simple. The fire had eaten the rest. His wife's fever had done what the flames couldn't, leaving him alone with a child, too young to understand why her mother wasn't coming back. A sharp clatter yanked him from the memory. Ben had dropped his carved horse. Daniel bent to retrieve it, setting it gently in the boy's hands. "You all right, Pa?" Anna asked from her place by the fire. "Just tired." But the lie tasted bitter. The next morning, trouble rode into town. 3 men on lean horses, their dust-stained coats hanging low over their hips, guns worn silver with use. They dismounted outside the saloon, tying their reins slow and deliberate. Heads turned as they stepped onto the boardwalk. Their eyes swept the street like men taking stock. Daniel watched from the edge of the livery yard, the pitchfork steady in his grip. He knew their kind, hard travelers, no wasted movement, the set of their shoulders telling of men who lived by what they could take. They spoke to a ranch hand outside the saloon. The words didn't carry, but the hand pointed toward the outskirts. Daniel's gut tightened. He turned back to his work, forcing his muscles to keep their rhythm. Maybe they were just passing through. Maybe. But when he looked again, one of them was glancing his way, eyes narrowing. By evening, the men had vanished into the hills. The cold came down sharper with the dark, and the Carter cabin glowed warm against the night. Samuel dozed by the hearth. Ben lay on his stomach, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick, and Anna read aloud from a book, her voice steady and low. Daniel stood near the door, staring at the frost gathering on the windowpane. Then he heard it, the slow crunch of boots in snow, not hurried, not hesitant. He lifted the rifle from its place by the wall, the wood familiar under his hands. Outside, the wind had died. The night was too still. He stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight, and let his eyes scan the yard. Moonlight washed everything in cold silver. Somewhere in the dark, something shifted, a shadow against the barn, a flicker of movement too quick to place. He felt the old tension coil in his chest, the same as it had 12 years ago. Inside, the fire cracked and Anna's voice faltered. A father's love built walls, he thought. But walls didn't keep the wolves from circling. They only made them hungrier. The knot didn't come. Instead, the dark split open with the flash of steel in the moonlight. Daniel caught the movement at the barn's edge, too close to draw a bead from the porch. He stepped down into the yard, rifle leveled, boots whispering through the crusted snow. A voice hissed from the shadows. "Carter." The man stepped forward, gun drawn. His coat was ragged at the cuffs, his face hard as cut stone, eyes pale as winter sky. "Not many men left who know that name," Daniel said, quietly. "Not many who live to tell it," the man replied. They circled each other, breath pluming in the cold. Daniel's thumb brushed the hammer. The man's finger tightened on the trigger. Snowflakes drifted between them, weightless, waiting. Then the stranger lunged. The guns barked, almost together, wood splintered on the barn wall, and the air stank of powder. Daniel pivoted, swinging the rifle stock into the man's jaw. Bone crunched. The stranger staggered, blood streaking his mouth. Daniel drove him back into the snow, wrenching the revolver free. He stood over him, chest heaving. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel tossed the revolver into the dark, out of reach. "Why were you here?" The man spat blood, smiled with a jagged tooth. "Ledger." The word hit harder than the cold. Daniel knelt, gripping the man's coat. "You tell me who sent you." The man didn't answer. Instead, he nodded toward his pocket. Daniel reached in and pulled out a paper, creased damp with sweat. Under the moon, he saw it clear. His own name, bold black letters, a sketch that was close enough to chill him. The bounty wasn't high enough to draw the desperate. This was something else. Daniel shoved the paper back into the man's coat. "Get out." The stranger smirked, rubbing his jaw as he rose. "We'll see each other again." Then he melted into the dark, leaving only the sound of his boots fading into the hills. By morning, Samuel had noticed the scuff marks in the snow and the faint scent of powder. He asked nothing, but the boy's eyes stayed sharp on his father all through breakfast. Anna was quiet, watching both of them, sensing the tension. When the plates were cleared, Daniel spoke. "We may need to move on, sooner than planned." Anna's hand stilled on the dishcloth. "Leave? But it's not safe here." "Pa," Samuel said slowly, "you always said running only makes a man tired." Daniel met his gaze, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps him alive." Anna's voice was tight. "What aren't you telling us?" "I've made enemies before. Old ones." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting right now." The silence that followed was heavier than the cold outside. Later, when Samuel went to the shed for tools, he found his father there, bent over a saddlebag. Daniel looked up, and something in his eyes warned Samuel not to push. Still, the boy's mind kept circling the same truth. Whatever trouble had found them now had been hunting a long time. That night, as the wind clawed at the shutters, Daniel lay awake, staring into the dark. He could still see the rain running down his hands 12 years ago, the night the fire took the cabin. But before the flames, there had been the days that led to them. The days when he'd worn a badge and believed in the weight of law. He'd been a deputy marshal then, riding the line between Deadwood and the Dakota Hills. The shipment was supposed to be routine, 2 wagons of gold dust-bound for the mint, guarded by men he knew. But the ambush had come swift, precise, and bloody. In the wreckage, he'd found survivors whispering of a ledger, names, amounts, routes, all proof of a theft tied to the richest and most dangerous in the territory. When Daniel found the ledger, it was tucked under a dead man's coat, bound in cracked leather. He'd meant to turn it in. But then the sheriff, his own superior, had called him in and told him to hand it over quietly. There'd been a look in the sheriff's eyes Daniel had never seen before. That was the moment he knew the law had already been bought. They came for him that night. Men with torches and guns, faces shadowed but voices sharp with rage. They'd wanted the ledger. Instead, they got fire and blood. His wife had lived through the night, but fever came after, and nothing he did could turn it. He buried her on a cold morning under a cedar tree, his little girl clutching his coat, and swore the men who took her would never touch Samuel or Anna. That meant disappearing, burying the ledger in a locked box, and taking a name that wasn't his. The sound of boots on the boardwalk pulled him from the memory. He was back in the present outside the feed store, stacking sacks of grain when 2 of the strangers from yesterday stepped into shadow. "Afternoon," the taller one said, voice like gravel. "We're looking for a man used to live near Deadwood. Name of Carter." Daniel didn't look up from the grain. "Can't help you." "Funny. Folks say you're good with a rifle." "Lot of folks are." The second man grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ledger burned up, huh? Shame." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're barking up the wrong tree." They stepped closer. "You got a week, Carter. Then we come for what's ours." Daniel let them walk away, without a word. His hands were steady on the grain sack, but inside, something was shifting. What he didn't see was Samuel in the alley across the street, the boy's eyes following every movement. That night, after the lamps were blown out and the fire sank to embers, Samuel lay awake. The words he'd overheard wouldn't let him rest. Ledger. Carter. The pieces didn't fit clean, but they were starting to take shape. He rose without sound, pulling on his coat. The barn door creaked faintly as he slipped inside. The smell of hay and horse filled the cool air. He'd been in here 1,000 times, but tonight his eyes moved differently, searching. It didn't take long. Under a loose board in the hayloft, he found the iron box. It was heavier than it looked, cold, even through the cloth wrap. The lock was solid, the kind that would break before it bent. Samuel turned it in his hands, feeling the weight, not just in iron, but in the way it seemed to hum with his father's silence. Somewhere below, a horse stamped its hoof, and from the house came the faint rasp of a cough. He set the box back, covering it carefully, but the questions had already taken root. Whatever was in there, it was worth more than gold to the men hunting them, and maybe more than trust to the man keeping it hidden. He climbed down and stepped into the cold night. Above him, the stars hung sharp and close, unblinking, as if the whole sky was listening. Samuel didn't sleep. The image of the iron box in the hayloft sat behind his eyes, heavy as a stone in his gut. By morning, his father's voice cut through the thin light, calling him to the table. Samuel sat across from him, the steam from the coffee twisting between them like smoke from a slow fire. Daniel's eyes were steady, but there was a distance to them, as though he were measuring something unseen. Samuel cleared his throat. "I found it. In the barn." The fork in Daniel's hand paused over his plate. "You found what?" "The box. The one you've been hiding." Samuel's voice didn't shake, but his heart was hammering hard. "Those men in town, are they after it?" Daniel set the fork down. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "It's not for you to worry about," he said finally. Samuel leaned forward. "You've been coughing blood, haven't you? I've seen the handkerchiefs." Daniel's gaze flickered, a crack in the wall he'd built. "That's not the point. It is the point. If you're sick, if you can't, I can." His voice was low but firm. Then softer, "I've been holding this family together for 12 years, Sam. You think I'd let go now?" Anna, who'd been standing by the stove, turned. "What's in the box, Pa?" Daniel looked at them both, and something in his shoulders sagged. "Ledger," he said at last. "Proof of what a gang of men did a long time ago, men with money and reach. I was a lawman once before all this. Found their book, kept it out of their hands. Your ma," his voice caught, then steadied. "She died because they wanted it back." The words landed heavy, filling the room with a cold that had nothing to do with the wind outside. Samuel's jaw worked, but no words came. Anna stepped closer. "If they're coming, we can't just wait here." Daniel's eyes sharpened again. "No, we prepare." By noon, they were moving with purpose. Daniel showed Samuel where to place boards over the windows, how to set up firing lines from the barn and the porch. Anna packed food and blankets for Ben, then walked him to Mrs. Harrow's place on the far side of town. She came back with her braid tight and her eyes bright with resolve. The hours slipped by, the sun bleeding toward the horizon. Daniel cleaned his rifle on the porch, the metal glinting in the late light. Samuel checked the ammunition, his fingers steady despite the knot in his chest. They spoke little. Words felt like they would draw the danger faster. The first rider came just after dark, a lone silhouette against the last rim of red in the west. Then two more followed, their horses stepping slow, hooves muffled in the snow. They stopped just beyond the yard, the breath from the animals rising in ghostly clouds. One called out, voice carrying in the stillness, "Evening, Carter. We're here for what's ours." Daniel stepped to the edge of the porch. "It's not yours." The man laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You hid it 12 years. That's a long time to be looking over your shoulder. Hand it over. We let you breathe another winter." "Not gonna happen." The air snapped as the first shot cracked, would splintered near Daniel's head, and he dropped behind the porch rail. Samuel's rifle answered, the recoil biting his shoulder. One of the riders reeled in the saddle, cursing. The night erupted. Gunfire flashed from a yard in the barn, the sharp smell of powder rolling through the cold air. Horses screamed and stamped, kicking up snow and dirt. Samuel caught sight of one man slipping toward the side of the barn and fired, driving him back. Daniel moved like a man who'd walked this ground 1,000 times, using the dark and the fence lines to his advantage. Twice his cough bent him double, but he came up firing each time. A bullet struck the porch post, showering him with splinters. He ducked, low, reloaded, and caught Samuel's eye across the yard. "Keep to cover," he called. Minutes stretched, each breath burning in the lungs. One man went down near the fence, his horse bolting into the dark. The others pulled back, regrouping in the shadows. The sudden quiet was worse than the shooting, like the whole night was holding its breath. Daniel knew what came next. He slipped back into the house, moving quickly to the table where the saddlebag lay. Samuel followed him in. "What are you doing?" the boy demanded. Daniel didn't answer. He opened the bag, slid the iron box inside, then closed it tight and pressed it into Samuel's hands. "Take it." Samuel shook his head. "No, we fight together." Daniel gripped his shoulder. "You will, just not here. You ride to the marshal in Rapid City. Give him the ledger. Don't stop for anyone. I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are." Daniel's voice softened, but the steel was still there. "I could buy you time. That's what I've been doing since the day you were born." A noise outside, the crunch of boots on snow. Too close. Daniel shoved Samuel toward the back door. "Go." But Samuel hesitated just long enough for the window to shatter, a shot ripping through the room. Daniel returned fire, the flash lighting the hard lines of his face. Samuel bolted through the kitchen, the saddlebag heavy on his back. He swung into the barn, grabbed his horse, and kicked hard into the night. Behind him, the crack of gunfire rolled over the hills. Daniel stepped out into the yard, rifle ready. Two men advanced from the shadows, guns up. He dropped the first with a shot to the chest, then swung toward the second. Pain lanced through his side, hot and sharp, but he held his ground. They circled him, each looking for an opening. He coughed hard, tasting blood, but his eyes never left theirs. "Come on then," he said, voice low. They came. The fight was close and brutal, steel and wood, boots in snow, fists driving bone. Daniel took another shot in the shoulder, but drove his rifle, but into the man's jaw, sending him down hard. The last one ran for the fence, but Daniel followed, driving him toward the river's edge where the ice cracked faintly underfoot. The man turned, gun rising. Daniel fired once. The man dropped, his weapon sliding across the ice. Daniel staggered back, every breath a knife. In the distance, he heard hoofbeats, Samuel riding hard. He smiled faintly, though it hurt. The cold was closing in now, the world narrowing to the hiss of the river and the stars above. He lowered himself to the bank, the snow soaking through his coat. Somewhere in the dark, the remaining horses were galloping away. Footsteps crunched behind him. Anna's voice broke the night. "Pa!" She dropped to her knees beside him, hands shaking. He managed to raise a hand to her cheek. "You're supposed to be with Ben." "I couldn't. You've got to keep them safe now." His voice was barely more than a breath. "Don't live in the shadows, Anna. Not like I did." Tears blurred her eyes, spilling hot onto his cold skin. "I can't do this without you." "Yes, you can." His hand slipped from her face, falling into the snow. His gaze stayed on hers a moment longer, then drifted toward the stars. When Samuel returned with the marshal 2 days later, the yard was quiet. The bodies were gone, buried by the neighbors who'd found Anna kneeling in the snow. The ledger was in Samuel's saddlebag, just as his father had left it. The marshal read enough to know it would bring down men who'd thought themselves untouchable. "Your pa died doing what he thought was right," he told Samuel. Samuel nodded once, jaw set. "Then I'll finish it." Spring came slow that year. The river thawed, the hills turned green, and the Carter place stood empty for the first time in 12 winters. Samuel rode into town with Anna and Ben, the ledger wrapped in oilskin at his side. He handed it to the marshal without ceremony. "This belongs in the light," he said. The marshal took it, eyes narrowing with respect. "So, did your pa." As they turned to leave, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of cedar from the hill where Daniel rested. Samuel glanced back, once, the brim of his hat low over his eyes. Then he set his heels to his horse, riding toward the wide, open road. The frontier had taken their father, but it had given them something too, a name worth carrying and a promise worth keeping. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the men who had once hunted them would hear the sound of hoofbeats and know that the Carters were still riding, and they weren't running anymore.